Iran just shut down $13 billion in annual exports. Overnight. No warning, no negotiation, no transition period. Every petrochemical cargo, not yet cleared, called back. Every producer in the country ordered to stop. Plastics, fertilizers, polymers, agricultural chemicals, all of it redirected inward, away from the global market, away from the revenue stream that has kept Iran's civilian economy breathing for years. And Washington is standing at a podium calling it a win. That is the story everybody is getting wrong right now. This is not an economic story. This is not a sanctions story. This is a signal, and the people who have seen this signal before are not in the White House. They are in Beijing. What Iran just did, the specific way it did it, the timing of when it did it, the silence surrounding why it did it, that combination has a historical pattern. And the last time a country sent that exact pattern, what followed changed the entire global order. So before America finishes celebrating, somebody needs to ask the question that nobody in mainstream coverage is asking. What does a nation do after it seals off its economy and gets told by the most powerful military on earth that it controls nothing? If this is the kind of analysis that never makes it onto your cable news feed, hit subscribe right now, because this channel covers the stories that matter before they become crises. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You need to be here for what comes next. Let's start with the number, $13 billion a year. That is what Iran's petrochemical sector generates in export revenue. It is not a secondary industry. It is Iran's single largest source of non-oil income, the economic spine of a country that has been under relentless sanctions pressure for years. The Mashhad complex and the Assalouieh plants together produce roughly half of that output. Plastics that go into manufacturing, fertilizers that go into agriculture, polymers that go into construction. These are not luxury exports. These are the industrial bloodstream of a functioning economy. And a senior official at Iran's national petrochemical company just issued a directive to every producer in the country to stop exporting immediately. Not slow down, not pause selectively, stop. Every cargo not yet cleared was recalled. All supply redirected inward until further notice. That directive did not come after weeks of deliberation. It did not come after failed negotiations. It came the same day the naval blockade went up, the same day, not a week later, not after talks collapsed. The same morning the blockade began, Iran turned its economy inward. You need to sit with that timing, because that timing is everything. The official explanation from Tehran is straightforward. The strikes on Mashhad and Assalouieh disrupted production capacity. Domestic industries are running short of raw materials. The government needs to protect local supply chains. And all of that is documented. Iranian citizens on the ground are describing factory closures and mass layoffs. There is a nationwide internet shutdown. Iran's central bank sent a private assessment directly to President Pezeshkian, warning that the war's economic damage could take up to 12 years to repair. 12 years. That is not a country in temporary distress. That is a country that has been told by its own financial institutions that the damage is structural, deep, and generational. So when you put those two things together, a 12-year recovery timeline and an immediate decision to stop exporting the second largest revenue stream, the official explanation starts to feel incomplete. Because a country that desperately needs revenue to survive a 12-year reconstruction does not voluntarily cut off that revenue unless it has already made a calculation that the revenue is no longer the point. That is what nobody in Washington appears to be seeing. The move Iran made is not the move of a country trying to manage economic damage. It is the move of a country that has decided what comes next will not involve trading with the outside world. Now let me give you the framework that explains why this matters. I call it the cornered state pattern. It works like this. When you apply maximum pressure to a country that has already been severely damaged, you force that government to make one of two calculations. The first calculation is that surrender is cheaper than resistance, that a deal on the adversary's terms, even a humiliating one, costs less than continued destruction. That is the calculation that produces negotiation. That is the outcome every blockade, every sanctions regime, every escalation in modern history has been designed to produce. The second calculation is fundamentally different. It happens when a government looks at the pressure being applied and concludes that waiting means certain defeat, that the trajectory of the current situation leads to an endpoint that is worse than any risk involved in making the most dangerous move available while the capacity to make that move still exists. The difference between those two outcomes is not determined by the severity of the pressure. It is determined entirely by the cornered government's internal assessment of whether resistance is still survivable. The moment a government concludes that survival through waiting is no longer possible, the pressure stops being a tool for negotiation. It becomes the trigger for escalation. And here is the part that should terrify every American watching this: that internal calculation is almost never visible from the outside in advance. It is invisible until after the move has been made, at which point analysts go back through the record and find every signal they missed: the economy turning inward, the supply chains being protected, the domestic industries being prioritized over export revenue, all of it pointing in the same direction, all of it ignored because the side applying the pressure was watching their own numbers and calling them a win. That is exactly what America is doing right now. Secretary Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium and said, and these are the words I need you to hold on to: "While you are digging out, we are only getting stronger." He said the blockade is the polite way this can go. He said the United States is locked and loaded on Iran's power grid, its energy infrastructure, its civilian electricity supply, and then he said the sentence that defines this entire moment: "You can't control anything." Now, I want to be fair to Hegseth before I explain why I think that statement may be one of the most strategically dangerous things said publicly in this conflict. He is not wrong about the economic pressure. The blockade is working in the narrow sense that every blockade is designed to work. Ships have been turned back. Export revenues are under severe simultaneous pressure. The 12-year central bank assessment is real. The factory closures are real. The internet shutdown is real. America has done serious, sustained, documented economic damage to Iran. Hegseth is correct about every number he cited. What Hegseth may be catastrophically wrong about is what those numbers produce, because telling a cornered state that it controls nothing is not a negotiating tool. It is a provocation. It is the verbal equivalent of removing the last exit from a room and announcing to the person inside that they have no options. Sometimes that produces surrender, and sometimes, in the specific circumstances where it does not, it produces the most dangerous move the cornered state has available. History does not leave ambiguity about which circumstances produce which outcome. And right now, several of the specific circumstances that historically predict the dangerous move rather than surrender are all present simultaneously. We are at the midpoint of this analysis, and I need you to stay with me, because what comes next is the part that Washington is completely blind to. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now. Share this video with someone who still thinks this is just about oil prices. This conversation needs to reach people before the next 96 hours run out. Here is where China comes into this story, and specifically why China's reading of this situation should alarm every American more than anything Hegseth said at that podium. Go back 85 years, July 1941. The United States imposed a total oil embargo on Japan. Japan was dependent on American oil for roughly 80% of its military fuel. The American calculation was clean and simple. Cut off the oil, Japan cannot fight, Japan negotiates, America wins without firing a shot. For several months, Tokyo appeared to be doing exactly that. American and Japanese diplomats were meeting. Proposals and counter-proposals were circulating. From the outside, the picture looked like a country under pressure moving toward a deal. What American intelligence either did not see or did not understand the significance of was what Japan was doing internally during that entire negotiating period. Japan was turning its economy inward, redirecting industrial output toward domestic military production, securing domestic supply chains, preparing its population for an extended period of self-reliance. The outward signals said negotiation. The inward signals said something else entirely. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The structural signature of what Japan did in the months before that attack, the specific pattern of internal economic adjustment that preceded the most dangerous move, is what China's strategic tradition has spent generations studying, not because China is inherently hawkish, because China has watched empires pressure countries into corners and then stood there in stunned disbelief when those countries did not behave the way the pressure was supposed to make them behave. China knows what this looks like. China recognizes the signature. And China is watching Iran right now with a level of analytical concern that Washington does not appear to share. China did not build its strategic position in reaction to this war. That is the part that should make every American stop and reconsider the entire framing of this conflict. China built 1.22 billion barrels of strategic crude reserves over 2 years, specifically from sanctioned Iranian and Russian oil, positioned deliberately so that when a moment exactly like this arrived, China would not be the country scrambling. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and Brent crude spiked past $120 a barrel, China did not panic. Its markets held. Its refineries kept running, while Japan, South Korea, Germany and the United Kingdom were scrambling for energy alternatives. While Europe discovered it had roughly 6 weeks of jet fuel remaining, China was sitting on 120 days of supply cover at normal import levels. The International Energy Agency described what happened as the largest energy crisis the world has ever faced. China called it a manageable situation. That gap in response is not luck. It is not coincidence. It is the product of a decade of deliberate preparation that Western analysts spent years dismissing as excessive caution or economic nationalism. China also built the infrastructure to keep buying Iranian oil through the blockade, a dark fleet system, ships that turn off their tracking transponders, payments settled in yuan rather than dollars, second-tier Chinese banks operating entirely outside the SWIFT financial network that American sanctions depend on, and Chinese refineries, known as teapots, that process sanctioned oil without asking questions about its origin. China built that entire architecture years before the first American bomb fell on Iranian soil, and it worked. Iran has been exporting oil above its pre-war average through the darkest weeks of this conflict because China made sure the pipes stayed open. That is not a country reacting to events. That is a country that decided years ago which direction this history was moving and prepared accordingly. Now here is the convergence that nobody in mainstream coverage is treating with the seriousness it deserves. When Iran turned its economy inward, when that directive went out to stop all petrochemical exports, Chinese refiners, including CNOEC, were already under government instruction to stop accepting new fuel export contracts. Both countries at the same moment making the same structural adjustment, redirecting supply inward, reducing exposure to the global trading system that American economic power depends on controlling. That parallelism is either the most extraordinary coincidence in contemporary geopolitics or it is coordination. And given that Iran's foreign minister confirmed that military cooperation with Russia and China continues, given that senior Chinese officials were in Beijing meeting with Iranian counterparts in the days before the blockade, given that Russia is actively providing Iran with satellite intelligence for ongoing operations, the probability that this is pure coincidence is somewhere close to zero. The Washington Post framed it with precision that most American outlets have failed to match. China and Iran weaponized the global economy to beat America at its own game. America once had a near monopoly on economic warfare, the ability to cut a country off from dollar-denominated trade, from SWIFT, from global shipping networks. That was the American superpower of the post-Cold War era. That monopoly has been broken, and the way it was broken, through years of patient, quiet, unglamorous system building that Western analysts consistently dismissed, is exactly how China operates when it has made a strategic decision and is executing against it over a decade-long timeline. So where does this leave us? There are 3 paths forward from this moment, and the cornered state pattern tells us what each one looks like and which signals indicate which path is becoming more likely. The first path is what I'll call the Libya outcome. In 2003, Muammar Gaddafi looked at the American pressure he was facing, looked at what had just happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and concluded that a deal on American terms, even a deeply humiliating one, was better than any available alternative. He surrendered his weapons program entirely. He survived in power for another 8 years. This is the outcome Hegseth believes Iran is moving toward. It is theoretically possible. But Libya in 2003 was not facing 12 years of economic reconstruction. Libya had not had its supreme leader assassinated in the opening days of the conflict. Libya did not have over 3,000 documented civilian deaths from 40 days of bombing. And critically, Libya did not have a strategic partner sitting on the outside of the pressure with 1.22 billion barrels of reserves and an entire parallel financial architecture specifically engineered to make American sanctions ineffective. The structural conditions that made the Libya outcome achievable for Gaddafi simply do not all exist for Iran's current leadership. That does not make the Libya path impossible, but it makes it substantially less likely than Washington appears to believe. The second path is the one that keeps China up at night and should keep every American awake too. Iran concludes, exactly as Japan concluded in the fall of 1941, that the window for its most dangerous move is closing. That waiting means certain defeat. That acting now, while fast attack boats are still in the water, while mines are still in the strait, while missile capability remains operational, while tunnel networks survive that American bombs could not fully destroy, while Hormuz remains within Iran's capacity to interdict and proxy networks from Yemen to Lebanon remain intact. Acting now gives Iran a chance that waiting 6 more months will not. What would that move actually look like? It does not have to be a direct military confrontation with American forces, though that cannot be ruled out. It could be releasing Houthi forces in Yemen to resume full Red Sea operations simultaneously with Gulf operations, creating 2 simultaneous choke points affecting 30 to 40% of global seaborne trade at the same moment. It could be a decision on uranium enrichment that crosses a threshold the entire world has been watching for years, and that would fundamentally change the strategic calculation of every country in the region. The specific nature of the cornered state's most dangerous move is always underestimated by the side applying the pressure, because the pressure side keeps calculating based on the cost it would bear from that move, and not the cost the cornered state has already decided internally that it can absorb. The petrochemical halt, the inward economic turn, the parallel Chinese supply chain adjustment, the silence around second-round ceasefire talks. These data points do not inevitably point to the Japan path, but they point directionally toward it, and the signal is not subtle. The third path is the one China is actively working to produce, a negotiated settlement that allows both sides to claim something real, that opens the Strait of Hormuz, that ends the blockade in a manner both governments can present domestically as something other than total capitulation, and that allows China's strategic reserves to transition from emergency buffer to permanent structural energy relationship. China is pushing through every back channel available, through Pakistan, through Turkey, through Gulf intermediaries, through every diplomatic backdoor that exists between Washington and Tehran. China told the White House it will not send weapons to Iran, whether that is literally true or strategically positioned, saying it keeps China at the table in Washington's calculations and buys diplomatic space for the back channel work to continue. China's bet is that if it can get both parties to a table before the current ceasefire expires, the outcome looks from the outside like a draw and functions from China's perspective like a decisive strategic victory. Iran survives as a functioning state, Hormuz reopens, America declares victory and moves on, and China achieves permanent structural energy independence from American maritime control, which is the strategic objective China has been building toward for a decade, and which the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, now appearing in China's official 5-year plan documents, would cement permanently, regardless of what happens in the Persian Gulf. That is a very good outcome for China, and China is working very hard to produce it. The problem is that this third path requires Iran to believe it has more to gain from a deal than from escalation. And right now, based on the specific signals Iran is actually sending rather than the signals Washington wants to see, that belief does not appear to be where Tehran is. Watch the next 96 hours, not what Iran says, what Iran does not do. Because the most dangerous signal in the cornered state pattern is not a threat, and it is not a statement, and it is not a demand, it is a silence. A decision made in a room in Tehran that nobody announces and nobody broadcasts and nobody leaks in advance. A decision that looks from the outside like a country still negotiating options and looks from the inside like a country that has already chosen a direction and is simply waiting for the right operational moment to act on it. China knows that silence. China has studied it across centuries of strategic history. China is watching for it in real time right now. And the gap between what America is concluding from the economic pressure it is applying and what China is concluding from the same set of facts is not a minor analytical disagreement. It is the most consequential strategic gap in this entire conflict, not the gap between Iran and America at a negotiating table. The gap between Washington and Beijing in how they are reading what Iran is actually doing and what Iran is actually about to do. America applied maximum pressure and told a cornered state it controls nothing. History does not offer comfort about what comes next when that specific sequence of events unfolds. The side applying the pressure always assumes that greater force will produce surrender. History shows repeatedly, painfully, expensively, that when a nation believes its options are running out, it does not simply bend, it recalculates. And once that recalculation is complete, once the leadership of a cornered state has concluded internally that waiting is more dangerous than acting, the strategic equation changes in a way that no amount of additional pressure can reverse. Pressure no longer drives compromise, it accelerates the clock. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. The second round of talks has no confirmed date and no confirmed location. The petrochemicals are shut down, the economy is pointing inward, the parallel adjustment is running in Beijing, and the Pentagon is telling the world that Iran controls nothing. Somebody in Washington needs to be asking what history says happens next, because Beijing already knows the answer. And Beijing is very, very worried. If you made it to the end of this analysis, you already understand why this story matters more than almost anything else happening in the world right now. Subscribe, leave a comment telling me which of the 3 paths you think Iran is actually on, because I want to know what you see that I might be missing. Share this video with everyone who thinks America's winning because the oil price went up. The next 96 hours will tell us more than the last 40 days. Be here for it.